So you want to make a game with a procedurally generated map. Maybe you've played games like Minecraft or No Man's Sky and enjoy the infinite possibilities those games offer. I'm in the middle of developing my own game that's loosely based off of Boardgame I made, where exploration and building are fundamental to making your hero stronger. Here in this digital space, I can take advantage of making a world endlessly explorable, and so I set out to do exactly what you're watching this video for. And there's a couple things I picked up on the way that you need to know to get started on the right path. Number 1, pick a shape. You have 3 options here. Choose wisely. There's equilateral triangles, squares, and hexagons. Those are the only shapes that fit neatly together. Now, triangles aren't very versatile, and you'll probably regret choosing this shape, but if you're going for a realistic looking terrain and you're only generating a single layer, meaning you don't have to use pyramids, this might make sense. Although I still think you're just better off at using hexagons. Squares are the gold standard for multi-layer procedural generation. Cubes fit easily on the XZ and on the Y-axis, and making a grid for them is easy. Hexes are a bit trickier. They fit together neatly on a 2D plane, but there's no such thing as a 3D hexagon. The closest thing is a truncated octahedron, but that still uses 4 square sides with 6 hexagon sides. So if you're doing multi-layer generation, you'll have to use a hexagonal prism. I've had this video game idea for a long time, but Incandescent Games inspired me to actually begin making it, and in his game Planet Smith, he uses hexagonal prisms as his base. For me, my game is only a single layer of terrain, and my board game uses hexes, so it made sense to stick with that. And hexes are basically 6 triangles connected at the center where you can manipulate the vertices height anyways. So for me, triangles don't really make sense. You're just making it harder on yourself. Just pick hexes. You're going to be better off with hexes. Step number 2, make a grid. For triangles, each column will face opposite directions to fit. Squares are by far the easiest. Their coordinates line up perfectly with their placement. Hexes are a bit trickier. There are formulas to set up the grid. Every other hex will need to be shifted down, which sounds simple enough, but it can be easy to get lost when you're troubleshooting because you're building hexes on a 2-vector grid, but hexes are a 3-vector shape. By the way, you're going to want to create a world grid class that stores all the noise map data you're going to generate for these building blocks. More on that later. Step number 3, understanding terrain generation. So there are 2 functions you're going to use to generate terrain, and understanding both is key to making this successful. One is a random number generator. Contrary to the name, the numbers actually aren't random. If you give it the same seed, it will return the same output every time, assuming the parameters are the same also. That means like Minecraft, you can have worlds with seeds that always spawn the same map. That is also true for your second generator, the noise map. Noise is a function that returns a value anywhere between -1 and 1. You can ask for a specific coordinate on the noise map and it will return the same number every time. It's almost like asking for the color of a specific part of a painting. It's just there, and changing the seed changes the painting. Most people use Perlin noise for realistic terrain as it creates a pretty good natural look, slowly and randomly changing between different elevations. To generate terrain, you'll probably want more than one noise map if you're going to include different biomes. Running the noise function can be expensive, so you'll also want to store this data in a dictionary in that world grid class I mentioned. It'll be easier to look it up in a dictionary than to regenerate it again later. Step number 4, make a chunk system. So this is going to be one of the bulkier projects to get procedurally generated terrain. You'll want to generate it in batches. Constantly unloading and loading the furthest parts of your terrain will make your game a laggy mess. Minecraft uses 16 block chunks. I found that for hexes, my game benefited the most from 8 hex chunks. Step number 5, putting it all together. This is where I'm going to tell you my journey developing the world generation portion of my game, and hope that you can learn from some of the mistakes that I made. And now that you understand the basic of what goes into world generation, here's how to put it all together. First, let me tell you what I was trying to do so you can see the end goal. My game is a hex-based RPG game that is focused on fighting, exploration, and building. I guess it will feel kind of like you're playing a Legend of Zelda game in a Lord of the Rings universe while still maintaining a familiar board game-like feel. You'll need to build cities to make your hero stronger and to trade with nearby cities, and the buildings you can construct depend on the type of hex tile you're building on. It's called Kingdom of the Lost Sword, and if you'd like to show your support, please comment below and follow the project on GitHub. I'm looking into other ways for you to support the project, but that's it for now. With that said, that means world generation needed to include biomes and different hex tiles that can generate per biome. For example, the Forest Peaks biome will have more forest tiles, and this grassy plains will have more grass tiles. The desert is mostly sand tiles. So to do this, I made 2 noise maps and a randomizer. One noise map is for elevation, one for humidity, and the randomizer for picking the tile in each biome. Tile selection was pretty easy. Each biome has specific tiles to choose from, each with their own weight on how likely it is to spawn. This is how ore generation in Minecraft works, and my randomizer adds the total weight of all the tiles and picks a number somewhere in between, and boom, tile selected. Pretty simple and a predictable outcome. It's the same with every seed. I next focused on getting elevation right. I used my elevation noise map to generate the height of each tile, but the first issue I ran into was, you'll notice that between each chunks is a pretty significant difference in height. However, the difference between the actual tiles themselves was not so big. This was because I was mixing my height map grid systems. Make sure you're manipulating height per block and not adding a height map to the chunk. If you want a terrain multiplier depending on the chunk it is or the biome, we'll get more into that later. Later I was able to achieve this effect, which did look a lot more natural. Now you may be doing a vertical grid system too, so this may not apply to you, but I want to achieve a natural looking hex terrain instead of a blocky look, so I had to spend a lot of time figuring out how to manipulate the vertices so that I can get the tiles to connect. It was a lot of work, but I eventually figured out and was able to achieve this effect. Now here I ran into 2 issues. The first was the hexagons I were using were cylinder meshes with 6 radial segments. This means it was effectively still a cylinder and had a bunch of other vertices I wasn't accounting for. This means I would get stuck under some faces that got left behind when editing meshes. I could have just added enough height to them to effectively eliminate the problem, but that's extra wasted geometry left behind that my CPU still has to process. This meant I had to learn Godot's surface tool to generate meshes manually. This worked much better as now each hex only had 7 vertices instead of 20 plus. The other bugs that I ran into was I was averaging the vertex height based on the 2 neighboring heights without accounting for its own height. That meant that the hex would have a general angle that looked right, but not actually connect to the hexes next to it. The right way was to add all 3 vertices height together and divide by 3, getting an average of each tile involved. However, I didn't want hex tiles to get too vertical, and I wanted to have some cliffs, so I made a rule that the hex next to it needed to be within the hex tile width and height in order to connect. Otherwise, make it a cliff. This later led to some problems, but eventually created some really cool looking terrain. At this point I needed to optimize. I had gotten wall meshes working, but they weren't lining up perfectly with the edge below, and walls were being created unnecessarily below the map. I also found out that I was doing triple the amount of work that I needed to when generating chunks. This is where you're going to make huge performance improvements. First of all, when getting the height of neighboring tiles to get the tile to mesh with the terrain, I was pulling the data from the noise map instead of storing it and reusing it. That is why it is super important you keep data generation and mesh manipulation separate. Have a class that manages and stores data for you, including the noise maps, the chunks, biomes, and tiles. That way when you generate the data, you store it, and later you can check to see if the data is stored or not, and then generate it if it's not stored yet. This is going to save you a lot of speed. The next thing I found is I was redoing a lot of calculation when calculating the vertex height. When meshing a hex and calculating each vertices, I found the vertex height for not 1 but 3 hexes, yet I was only applying it to 1, moving on to the next hex and doing it again. Instead, I calculated the top 2 vertices of each hex, and then stored the data as the bottom 2 for the hex above it and the relative tiles to the left and right. Between these 2, chunk generation became much easier on the CPU, and there was no longer noticeable frame drop when generating chunks. I also cached chunk meshes that were already generated, so if you reloaded a chunk you had already generated in one session, it was very easy to put it back into the scene. I selected biomes based off elevation and humidity, and each biome has an ideal elevation and humidity. The biome of a chunk is decided by whichever biome is closest to that chunk's elevation and humidity. I also wanted biomes to affect the height map. I spawned mountain biomes at taller elevations, but it still felt like just the top part of a rolling hill. So I added a terrain multiplier to each biome. Now when you do this, you're going to want to take the weight of all biomes on that chunk and determine the chunk's terrain multiplier based off that. If you just go off the chunk's biome alone, you'll run into what I ran into, which is seams at the chunks of different biomes. In fact, here you'll see I printed the terrain multiplier per hex, and it has small changes because it takes all biomes' relative strength into consideration. That way, if I'm in a mountain biome and the terrain multiplier is 2, and I go into a forest biome where the terrain multiplier is 1, one chunk isn't way higher than the other. Finally, I added lighting and fog effects for each biome and a basic day and night cycle, and I ended up with this. Now it's not perfect, but I'm pretty darn happy with it. Phase 1 of my project was to get this down, which means I can finally begin Phase 2, which is basic gameplay mechanics including combat, building, and the player model. Hopefully you learned something useful. Make sure to like and subscribe as it helps me spend more time on these videos and on this project, and make sure to follow it on GitHub and comment your feedback